If I asked you, how happy are you in your primary relationship on a scale from 1 to 10, you'd probably think about it for a moment and then be able to give an answer, like a 7 or an 8 out of 10. But if I asked you, how would you rate the relationship you have with yourself, that might be a little more difficult to answer because we don't often think about the relationship we have to ourselves, at least not very consciously. Such as, do you love yourself? Do you trust yourself? Do you respect yourself? In this series we're about to embark on, that's what we're going to unpack. How do we nurture and grow our relationship with ourselves? Welcome to Immersion. I'm your host, Pamela, and here we dive into psychology and philosophy topics to find meaning in the modern world. Let's dive in. Now, before thoughts about how this is navel-gazing start to creep up, let's talk about why this is important for ourselves and for other people in our lives. You might be running into the same issues time and time again. For instance, not asking for a raise when you deserve one at work, or attracting the same kinds of partners that aren't quite right for you. And we might not realize when some of these issues are actually due to things such as self-esteem, rather than what's happening in the external world. I was talking to some friends in preparation for this episode because I wanted to know, is this something that people are thinking about on a day-to-day basis, their relationship with their self or working on self-esteem? And they said not so much consciously. They might sort of beat themselves up and think, why am I running into the same problem over and over again? Or why am I so lazy? Or on a day they're being harder on themselves, even thinking there's something wrong with me. But they even brought up that in times like their 20s, they weren't even aware of all of these thoughts. They were more subconscious. One of them said in her 30s was when she realized, oh, I actually feel that there's something wrong with me. And then while that hurt to realize, she could work on it directly. So it is important to realize that many people might have issues with their self-esteem and not even know it because these thoughts are suppressed. Another reason that this is extremely important is not just for ourselves, but for the good of the collective. Leaders that are secure in themselves prioritize the needs of the people and not their own ego. Someone in a home environment won't scream and yell to get their point across when they're secure in themselves because their self-worth does not depend on that other person validating them. They don't need the reaction that they want the same way. People that are secure in themselves also feel confident stepping into what they feel their purpose is and showing up and bringing their unique gifts, which also helps others. So if more people had a reasonably high self-esteem, the world would actually be a better place. And we're going to get into objections people might have about being worried about their ego or it growing too big at the end of this episode. But I first just wanted to address that this is not self-indulgent. In fact, it's very brave work. There's a bit of a going into the cave, the unknown, because some of it is difficult, facing truths that we may have buried for a very long time. But I can tell you that while certain things might feel scary to face, it's actually a lot more scary and exhausting to try to run from parts of ourselves indefinitely. And of course, like I always say, please loop in the appropriate support, such as a therapist when appropriate, particularly if you really struggle with things such as shame. And you might consider going through this series with a friend so that you have someone to work through the material with as you go. Another reason I want to do this series is because issues with self-worth or self-confidence, we might talk about them. For instance, oh yeah, I don't feel very confident in XYZ scenario, or I have a little bit of social anxiety, but then maybe we leave it there. We don't usually go deeper when we talk about this with people. And I don't think that we realize how pervasive this is. I was looking up how many people struggle with self-esteem. And if you Google that, there's a statistic that pops up all over the internet that says 85% of people have low self-esteem. But then if you dig into that, there's no real scientific research that backs that up. It's sort of just one of those numbers that keeps circulating on the internet. Someone says it because someone else did. And if we're looking from a clinical sense, I don't really think that that's studied, but the amount of people that likely struggle with it to the extent that other people greatly notice, it is terribly impacting their life and their ability to function, maybe 15%. But I don't think that means that it's not a problem for most people. I actually think that 85% number is more accurate. If we're thinking about the difference between getting by and thriving, I actually think it's incredibly rare to meet someone that is completely at peace with themselves, who truly loves themselves through and through. It's probably closer to 1% of the population, and it really stands out when you meet that person. I think that all of us have room to grow here. And just like any relationship, there's always ways you could continue to improve it, even with a partner. So I think that we can do this with ourselves too. Because for a lot of people, it's very much a house of cards situation. Maybe they feel good about themselves if they're delivering things well at work, and they feel like they look good when they leave the house, and their relationship with their partner is in a good place. And sure, there is this benefit of diversifying across a lot of different areas, but it's like they can feel good about themselves if everything's going right, versus a sort of deep down core sense that who they are is worthy and deserving of good things, and they're confident in the gifts that they can bring. But let's go into right now the curriculum of what we'll be covering in this series. It's going to be a pretty long series, similar to our positive psychology one. So I'm going to laundry list out here a bunch of the different areas we're going to cover in this series. A foundational text that we will cover is The 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem by Nathaniel Branden. It came out in the 90s. It's a bit of a classic in this space. We will also cover self-worth and validation, how much of that is coming from the outside versus the inside. Going off of this, we'll also cover how do we show up in relationships, specifically how much of our self-worth is from our relationships. And we'll do an episode on the idea of limerence. I don't know if you've heard of this, but it's basically when someone gets it's even more than a crush. They fall for someone in a very all-consuming way. Thoughts that are intrusive keep popping up in their mind. They cannot stop thinking about this person. They might adapt their schedule around them. Certain things in their life might start to suffer. And this is how a lot of people think of romantic love. And sometimes it is a part of the start of a relationship, but often it's when we feel destabilized in our sense of self and we look to another person to feel okay. And there's other reasons we do this too. So we will have a whole episode on that. We will discuss how trauma and past wounds affect our self-concept. I mean, of course they do, so we have to get into that. We'll also talk about identity and truly knowing ourselves. We cannot love ourselves if we don't truly know ourselves. We'll examine what philosophers have to say about this, from the ancient Greeks to the existentialists. We'll talk about being your own friend and truly caring for yourself, as well as regulating our nervous systems and how is this connected to being grounded in our body. And finally, envy, jealousy, and comparison. Because if you've been in the space of psychology or self-help for a while, you know that often these things have to do with how we feel about ourselves. But it can be really easy to forget, for instance, with the issue of something like comparison, and to think it's about that other person. So my hope is that this series can bring a sense of peace and grounding and newfound confidence in yourself that will affect your work, your relationships, most importantly, just be with you everywhere you go. I have been working on this I think we're all constantly working on it. Like when you go to therapy, of course, part of what you're working on is your relationship with yourself. But I've been very consciously thinking about it the last few months. And I've been noticing a lot of little changes, stuff that we'll be covering throughout this series. But for instance, noticing I don't have to stay in this conversation, or I really don't look good in that color and I have enough shirts. I'm not going to wear that color anymore. Or stopping on a day that I don't have to rush, and quite literally smelling the roses. That happened this weekend. And realizing that part of rushing is trying to be good enough in the eyes of others, always go, go, go. And a lot of times it starts to just be our autopilot way of functioning in the world. So there isn't an area of life that this does not touch. Because of course, it almost goes without saying that you are the only constant in every part of your life. So let's go into some foundational concepts that will serve us in the rest of this series. First, this is not static. This is something that will change. Sure, some day to day, but more over the course of your life. For instance, adolescence or, around 14 to 16 is when self-esteem is at its lowest. It might take dips at other points too in your life, depending on what else is going on for you. Also, you might have a better sense of confidence in certain areas. For instance, I keep talking about relationships and work as if those are only two areas. Something we'll talk about at the end of the series is the many, many different areas of life, such as spirituality and health, and really diversifying this sense of self. But You might feel really, really strong in some areas and not in others due to how competent you feel there. But that brings up another point is a lot of times when people think about confidence, they conflate it with efficacy and competence as if that's all there is. For instance, if they can deliver well at work, if they can show up well in their relationships, if they can push at the gym, as if it's all about what they're doing. And there's no other side of that compassion, acceptance, this other part of our relationship with ourselves. And actually, that only splits it into two. But when I was doing research for this series, I found about 23 different reoccurring terms or ways we could think about the relationship with ourselves. Now, instead of just listing 23 terms for you right now in a laundry list, which would not be that helpful, I broke them down into 5 buckets or areas. And if you're watching the video version, I will have those up on the screen right now. One is your belief in yourself. So this is self-confidence, self-trust, self-efficacy, the belief you can do what you want, and confidence in your skills. Another is knowing yourself, self-concept, self-knowledge, self-image, self-awareness. Some of these are kind of saying the same thing in different words. Some of them are not. For instance, we know trust and respect are very different, but self-image and self-concept, I mean, they're probably different, but there's a lot of overlap also between some of these terms. Another is valuing yourself, self-worth, self-respect, and that internal versus external validation piece. Another is your relationship to yourself, being your own friend, being on your side in your mind, to be comfortable and at peace with yourself. So I think of this as a very internal bucket. But then on the other side, there's caring for yourself, self-care, self-compassion, self-acceptance, advocating for yourself. You could think of this one more as love as a verb or the actions rather than the thoughts. Now, the point here is not to split hairs and separate these definitions. It's just to realize that your relationship with yourself is not one thing. Again, kind of like we talked about, it's not just can you deliver at work and are you attractive or something. I think people just really oversimplify with that kind of stuff. In fact, attractiveness has nothing to do with it, except for the fact of how society mirrors back things to us. But again, we'll get more into that later. But I think that often we might think, well, I do self-care. I do a face mask on Friday night and go to yoga. And we have this very one note way, I think, of thinking about it versus do you feel worthy at your core? It goes so much deeper than that, which is why I'm really excited to do this over many, many parts. The series will probably be about anywhere between 8 and 11 or 12 parts. So we're going to go deep each week on this. And caring for yourself can seem like small actions. For instance, realizing I don't feel good in my body. I don't feel nourished. I don't feel cared for. And then you maybe start to cook for yourself some in the evenings. This might seem small, but one, in a world that again wants us to rush around trying to do things for everyone else, caring for yourself can be a pretty radical act. And also, it's planting seeds that are going to bloom later. Something that we're going to cover quite a bit in the next episode is there's a cyclical nature between actions and how you feel about yourself. When you feel good about yourself, you take loving actions towards yourself. When you take those loving actions towards yourself, such as that home-cooked meal, you feel better about yourself. Think about a time that you chose to advocate for your own needs. Maybe you just said no when normally you would have said yes. Maybe you did, again, something small, such as I'm going to read a book tonight because that's just what I feel like I need. And then you felt better about yourself. You didn't literally just feel better because I wanted to read a book, I got to read a book. You felt better about how you feel about yourself because you took care of yourself. It's similar to relationships when they say love is a verb. In relationships with other people, we care about them, so we act a certain way that's loving towards them. And because we do that, the relationship flourishes. So there is this positive cycle, and we want to jumpstart that positive cycle with ourselves and that relationship too. And the thing I find most empowering about that is the fact that we can jumpstart this cycle. I think for so long, I knew that I was struggling with issues with self-worth or self-esteem, but it kind of just felt like a never-ending pit of, sometimes with psychodynamic work and therapy, and probably because I don't understand it because I'm not a therapist, but at least to me, it feels like, okay, we keep going into the history. Yeah, I know why I do that. yeah, we looked at the past, but what do I do now? And so that's where I really love psychodynamic. I think that often CBT is just like a Band-Aid without treating the wound. But I think often if we just go into the wound and we don't apply a Band-Aid or something, we're not moving on. That's how I feel about it. That's why I think looking really broad in the field of psychology is the most empowering thing to do. But if anyone's watching or listening who's a therapist, I would love to hear from you and see if you agree with that, or if that's only my perception. And I'm sure that my views on this will evolve over time. But let's keep going with a couple other closing thoughts. One research study that I thought was really interesting, that I'll link below, talked about how people that have issues with self-esteem are just as competent and can perform just as well as people that have high self-esteem. It's just that they predict that they will do worse on certain tasks, and they'll undercut their accomplishments later. So let's use an example of that. If someone was getting ready to maybe run for a public office, someone with low self-esteem might think that they're less likely to get elected. Or even if they did get elected, they might still have low self-esteem after by somehow saying, oh, well, my opponent had that scandal breakout that came out. And so really, I didn't do anything that impressive by getting elected. They might be nervous for the task at hand coming up. So it's pulling the rug out from under ourselves both before and after succeeding even. And so a lot of this can be as simple as seeing that and changing our thought processes to realize, wait, where have I actually done well? How can I take that in? But I think that even when you know that and you try to do that, it doesn't stick at first. It's kind of like when people say affirmations, I am loved, I am smart, I am curious, I am kind. Like they might say these things and it just like doesn't feel like it sticks. And I think it's important to start with where you're at and realize that not everything might stick, but it's almost like snow falling, snowflakes, where like little bits eventually do accumulate if you keep working on it. And then eventually you have the snow on the ground because enough of those tiny little flakes have stuck together. And that's partly why we're going to be coming at this from so many angles, because maybe for you, looking at who you're jealous of as a route to realize areas that you want to improve your life, where you feel insecure, maybe that's too painful. Or maybe for you, it's just painful enough that it's actually a window into an area where you're usually blind to seeing something. So by coming at this from 10 different angles coming up, I hope that it can be really helpful. Okay, so last two things and then we'll close out. First is the idea of, will this mean that we're going to have too big of an ego if we start working on this? Can you have too much self-esteem? And in the words of Nathaniel Branden from the 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem, he says, no, you cannot have too much self-esteem. It's similar to how someone can't have too much health. You can't have too much of something that is purely good. Now, you might say, well, like, what about someone that's being really grandiose and bragging and needs you to see that they're right? That person does not have high self-esteem. They are trying to get validation from you, and it does not feel good. I was talking to a friend the other day and they said, I think that I have a big ego. And I said, I don't think so. I think that you struggle with your sense of self. And so sometimes you feel really bad about yourself. And then sometimes you'll overinflate to maybe compensate from that and have an overinflated sense of self. So we're fluctuating between high and low places rather than seeing ourselves appropriately and in a very just normal middle ground way of our strengths, our weaknesses, what we bring to the table and what we struggle with. So that's another part of this. It doesn't mean that you're going to suddenly think that you're the best in the world, because that's not accurate. We're going to still see ourselves accurately. In fact, parents that told their kids growing up that they're the best at everything, that child will actually struggle with self-esteem later because they don't have an accurate view of themselves. And accuracy and seeing reality clearly is actually a huge part of this and being confident. So as you might have heard, this grandiosity is the other side of the same coin as feeling really terrible about yourself. And this is something that we will cover more in other episodes. And so to close, to give you a practical way to look at this, in the 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem, Branden says, to trust one's mind and to know that one is worthy of happiness is the essence of self-esteem. If we put that chart up from the beginning where we had those 23 areas, we broke them down into 5 buckets, most of them can really be put under one of these 2 headings. They're either about believing that you're appropriate to reality, that you can handle life's challenges, that you have a mind you can trust. For instance, self-trust would be under that. And then the other part is believing that you are deserving of love and to take up space in the world and you can accept yourself as you are, as a beautiful, flawed, wonderful human. And that's what I'm really excited to get into, is working on these 2 different parts of this together. And on that note, I want this to be deeply personal, meaning I don't want to intellectualize and hold these concepts at arm's length so that we don't end up actually changing. I think it is one thing to say that one struggles with self-worth or self-esteem, almost like an idea that they're able to keep in their mind, versus feeling where this came from or where this hurts the most. And in those feelings, this is cheesy, is where there's healing. So I do want to dive deeply into this in a personal way versus just sharing it like a book report. That doesn't mean I'm going to be airing my dirty laundry or everything I've learned in therapy or things that are too personal, but I just mean to say that I'm actively working on this. That's why I'm doing this. I'm not coming from a place of, I've done the work and I'm healed. No, I'm coming from a place of I'm working on it and I want to do this together. And again, it's a bit of a one-way conversation, which is always strange, which is why I keep talking about the SpeakPipe account where you can leave a voicemail for the show. But I did some research on it, and only about 1% of people will end up leaving voicemails for shows. So I think I just need to grow the show more. And then in time, there will be people that feel comfortable calling in. I also realize this is a really personal one, so not everyone might feel comfortable saying like, hi, I struggle with self-esteem and I like to talk about it. But maybe there's a certain topic or angle or something where it makes sense, and feel free to do that at any time. But I say this to mean that I hope that you in your own home, maybe with your friends or books that you're also working on that we talk about, that you can see some growth here and that we both don't purely intellectualize, like I was talking about, holding it at arm's length. Thank you for being here, for being open to spending time together and time working on your relationship with yourself. I'm really excited for this series together. Feel free to give feedback. If there's something that you want me to cover, now is a good time to send it in while I'm still in the beginning of the series so we can loop it in. Feel free to write into the show, call into the show, leave a comment on YouTube. Links for all of that are down below. Looking forward to diving in together. Speak to you soon.